Alright, part 4 of our digging into detail about the ecological approach. And as you can probably tell from some of these videos, differing light and quality and stuff. Some of this I recorded yesterday and some today. And I've had to have some fitness breaks, movement breaks in between videos and working on this sometimes. But maybe I'll throw a video or two in the mix in this stuff so we can have some real ideas about how are animals moving in an ecology. Add some practice to the theory and discussion. But so fundamentally, we move through an ecology perceptually. You know, we're animals after all. Human animals, but still animals. And, you know, we're not robots, as we've said. We're not robots driven by some physics calculating or calculus calculating dictator inside us. We're not like some mindless piece of meat. We're not like something like Descartes thought, where there was some mind that interacted with the body through the pineal gland and gave it orders and stuff. You know, as I say, no one cares about what Descartes said anymore. At least for the most part, you know. We use Cartesian coordinates. But a lot of stuff he did was influenced by Plato and was wrong. But for us, in movement in general and action, you know, and that'd be martial arts in particular to that, and BJJ in particular to that, decisions and information and action, decisions about action do not come from on high or from pure thought. We don't have some Platonic philosopher king in our heads telling us what to do. The world, remember, if you think about what the place is like we live in, and you know, we live in a dynamic, changing, complex world. Things happen, and we don't know everything in it. There's things that'll happen in the future that are outside of what we expected. Some stuff we might expect. There's some regularities, but there's things that are outside of our ken. You know, as some people say, there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. We don't know everything. We cannot dictate ahead of time what will happen. We can rely on some regularities and causes and use that to plan what we're going to do and then adapt as we go. But we cannot prescribe anything. We can't dictate to the world what it's going to do. And we're not omniscient. We're not prescient. Rather, if you look at how we actually do things, drive a car, do martial arts, play sports, move through the world, move through a crowd, exercise in nature to achieve some goal, we got to engage in constant feedback-informed adjustment of our action as we move in the changing world. You know, when we're doing that, we got to rely, if you think about those situations and other things, we got to rely on immediate awareness and feedback. And that means perception. Perception is our means of knowledge for what's happening right away. And it's our direct contact with the world. Concepts, as we've seen, as Aristotle, Galileo, Newton, and others, like Maria Montessori, figured out, concepts come from perception. As St. Thomas Aquinas said, nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses. And he's talking about, of course, what's true. He's not talking about false beliefs, made up stuff, or lies. You know, we need immediate awareness of what we're doing to achieve a goal. And that's what perception gives us. It gives us that immediate awareness of how we relate to things and how we're moving amongst things. And if you think about that, immediate awareness and feedback, what does it remind you of in war? Or in doing a dogfight or flying a plane? Yep, it's Boyd's OODA loop. And you can think of it as A standing for adaptation. So observe, orient, decide, adapt. Or instead of that, think of it as an observe, process, adapt loop. OPA. What? OPA. What? That's what some people call father or something. OPA. Or grandfather or something maybe. But we observe, we process, we adapt, and we go through it again. It's a loop. Like when people are in a dogfight, one person does something and observes everything around him and how the other pilot adapts what they do. Then is to adapt. You have to observe, process, and then adapt to that changing environment. And there's, as you see, it's not a dictator thing inside us. As in terms of the OODA loop and thinking of OPA, it's like to move through the world successfully, all animals, think about what they do. None of them, if we think about all animals, not just the human, that's what we're talking about, how we move through the world to achieve a goal. I don't think, worms and squirrels have a calculating dictator in their head, especially like squirrels. They don't even know what they're doing sometimes, never mind us. But with the OODA loop, you see there's this loop, this coupling and connection of action and perception. That's what Dr. Gray will talk about. And he actually calls his podcast, the Action Perception Podcast or something like that. Perception Action Podcast, I forget which way. But there's this coupling, this joining together, not just two separate things, but the concept of coupling means two things joined together, bonded, linked. So action and perception are coupling. And like I said before, or maybe not, I don't recall if I said that yesterday already, but we don't just perceive to move, we also move to perceive. They're coupled together after all. Perception is not decoupled from action, and action is not decoupled from perception. Our action is not driven by some impulse or thought that's out of touch with the complex, changing, dynamic reality we live in. We are in touch with that. Of course, since we have free will and we have concepts, we can do some really goofy things. And being conscious doesn't make us omniscient. We're not omniscient, we're omnipotent, so of course we can make mistakes. We do the best we can with the information available. A predator does not always catch its prey, and a prey does not always get away from a predator. We're not omniscient, we're not omnipotent. But we got to move to perceive and perceive to move. As you probably know, you just got to make the connection of what you maybe have heard about some animals to how we move as humans to what we're doing in BJJ or martial arts or everyday life, and then connect that to how we think about it. Then we get the right concepts of what we're doing so we can do it better and coach it and train it better. But as you know, some animals freeze when they think they could be spotted. Then it helps some other animal not see them. But one animal, if it moves around, then it can help see the other thing better. And that's what some things do in some situations. They move their heads to get a different perspective. And And then, it's like, because of the nature of the universe, that's the way things are. The world is like three-dimensional, geometric, you know. Um, there's space around us. And, whether it doesn't matter, Euclidean, non-Euclidean, you know, we live in a world of space and form, and we move through that. And perception is not instantaneous, like some instantaneous picture of a camera or instantaneous touch. It's over a period of time. You got to move around to perceive correctly. It takes time. It takes motion. And it's, when you dig into it, it's all over the place. You might think you're keeping your eyes steady on something, but you're not. There's all these little micro movements that go on. We can't stand perfectly 100% still. There's these like teeny tiny adjustments and all this stuff going on in our muscles and everything, you know? When our heart beats, we've got blood going through us and there's a little change. But we're moving a lot, and if some stuff is kept perfectly still, I think scientists have shown that we can't perceive properly. And there's experiments on animals in that regard too. So, when we think about other things in the world, it helps us understand better. And that's how we form concepts. Look at a bug. Aristotle showed we abstract similarities from certain things in contrast to some other things, like a squirrel in contrast to, depending on your context, maybe you're a kid, and maybe you probably haven't learned mammal yet, so you'd contrast squirrel with other living things implicitly. You wouldn't necessarily identify it that way, but you got squirrel in contrast to cat and dog, maybe, and human. Let's say for a lot of people, those are and birds, you got some things like that. Not a lot of different animals you'll necessarily see. Some insects, but keep it simple, and for the example, think about how you'd look at a squirrel and learn it in contrast to cat and dog, because they're so much more alike than a squirrel to a bird, or a squirrel to a butterfly, or a squirrel to a person. So you see some squirrels, these things, the behavior, sounds, the shape, the tail, they're similar, and it really stands out in your awareness in contrast to these other things. That's how we develop a concept like that. But likewise, we should look at other animals and see what they're doing to help develop concepts of what we're doing. We need to get some similarities. We need to have the right things to look at, the right concrete things to look at, to abstract away good similarities in contrast to some other things, to get really good ideas about how we move, how we actually function, how movement actually works, and then therefore how we should train and think about movement. Just because we have some idea doesn't mean it's right, or if some idea pops into our head, we should be like Galileo and Newton and Aristotle and Marie Curie and Maria Montessori and others. MLK. We should be like that in how we develop our conclusions in all areas. Really reason things out rigorously and scientifically as much as possible. We're not omniscient. We're limited in time. We can't do everything, but we could do more than we do. Dig into life, live it more. So we can use that process of abstraction to get ideas about how we move through the environment properly, how we really do it. Then we're well, instead of having some idea that we don't really understand, we don't know where it comes from, if we've got actual examples where we've pulled it from, then we're rooted in reality and we really know what's going on. And then if you make a mistake, you can more easily correct yourself instead of just being like, huh, what's going on? As some people say, induction is self-correcting. So if some scientists are doing a good job and forming concepts objectively and being logical and following a more Aristotelian approach, and an Aristotelian approach is developed by Galileo and Newton and others. If they're being like that, they could make a mistake, as we do, and then continue with induction, continue focusing on reality, and the mistake will be corrected. But so look at animals, and that'll help us figure out what we do. Now, we have to rely on immediate awareness and feedback, and that means perception. And forming concepts like that can help us learn, practice, train BJJ more, or some martial art, or some other thing much better. And it can help us help people teach and train it and coach it better. It's a different way to look at it in light of what we've said, the ecological approach, Aristotle's ideas about forming concepts, and what other people have added to that through the centuries to develop what Aristotle said, expand on it, and then correct some of the mistakes he had. Just like every other human, he made mistakes. But you could get, because we had talked about ecological approach to training. Jocko is talking about it in terms of BJJ, hence the focus on that. But we'd look at similar situations and look at them as, remember, a person being part of the environment that you're moving through, the person being of a certain nature, different than a rock, the environment being made up of all these things with different natures, individual things. Some things are similar, some are not, but you could think of what the commonalities are in the environment, or the things that do not vary. Motions, things, actions, and that'll help us understand better how to do the BJJ. We're not looking for ideals. We're looking for something that maintains the variation in things, not something that denies variation, but that recognizes it and helps us see how to adapt to it. So again, it's a new approach. It's not merely figuring things out on yourself or sparring. People can do a lot of sparring, but they ain't going to get the same out of it. It's not the ecological approach. That's not what it's about. The ecological approach would be about having people and helping people learn what's common in certain situations when they're training so they can get better, helping them learn. And you look for, as we'll talk about later, what J.J. Gibson called invariance. We look for invariance in things, in actions and movements, for these things that are on a perceptual level, not similarities in terms of forming concepts, but kind of similarities or invariance in perceptually and neurologically. We use those to help us control our movement. But that's a concept we'll discuss later. It's something important in the ecological approach. So, you can't dismiss the ecological approach if you say, and you cannot say you understand it if you don't even know what an invariant is. It's key to the theory, All right, so then a few things here. It's some main stuff about we move through an ecology perceptually. Then I'll add a few other points and expand on some of that stuff a little bit. But there's some context, help us better understand. There's no ideal technique. Platonism is wrong. Platonism does not work. It does not identify reality. There's no perfect angle to hold your elbow, wrist, and fingers to do something in BJJ or in tennis. That makes no sense. For a Platonist, that's what you might go for. You want to attain the quote-unquote ideal. And a technique would refer to some ideal form of some technique in some non-material dimension. I'm not interested in that at all. No, thank you. I'm interested philosophically. I love philosophy, but in terms of what's real and how I want to engage in practice and live, no thanks. Just like the Cartesian science, it's a joke, but yeah, I love philosophy. I love the history and science, the history and philosophy of science. So yes, I would study some Descartes in that context, but in terms of everyday practice and truth, no thank you, no thank you, no thank you. So trying to make people do what like do some Platonic influence training and coaching would be about something like that, doing an ideal. And then there is Plato, there is an effect in modern life of Platonic ideas. They've been put into effect, they're real, it's there, no one can deny it. Same thing with training, with a lot of things, politics, art, education, fitness, a lot of stuff. It's influenced some physics, some math. Some people are influenced by Platonic ideas and how they teach in college, so it's there. And we're better off when we know what it is so we can avoid it. We can see that thing in our environment, and then we can better move through our environment and understand it. Without something abstract like that, sometimes for humans, not for other animals, but for humans, without a concept for some things, we're unaware of it. You might have some inkling, maybe sort of, but you don't have a clear awareness of the thing's identity and what's going on. So knowing this Plato-Aristotle difference in thinking and epistemology is very important for us modern humans. But the Platonist ideas, think about it. Concepts are timeless, universal, perfect, unchanging, and that's not helpful for our changing dynamic world. It doesn't identify the facts of reality. And then it denies evidenced scientific conclusions, evidenced reasoned conclusions of science, I should say. A proper technique would be some adaptation to some environmental demands. And remember, environment includes humans for us. And remember again, as Gould pointed out, the individual, the variation is the real, not some Platonic ideal. Plato had it kind of backwards. It's not that ideas are more real than the world out there and what we perceive. The things we perceive are more real in a sense than our ideas. They're kind of they're both real, but in a different way. But in terms of what's real and out there, it's the variation, not the abstraction in the world. So technique would be how we adapt our limbs and body to do something like in BJJ or some martial art, how we adapt to some particular situation. You got to learn movement to fit an individual and varied situation. nothing is ever exactly the same, but still there's the same but different. There are similarities in reality. If there weren't, we couldn't form concepts. And on a perceptual, neurological level, there are invariants, as J.J. Gibson called them. But here's a way to think about the reality of the Platonic situation. It's kind of what some people do. Could be Platonic thinking, but it's poor thinking in some other way, if not Platonic, the way some people are. You've heard about probably some people, they do some martial art, they do some techniques in a controlled environment where change and variation is minimized and limited. They have a more willing partner, and they do it, and they might get good at it and think they're invincible. Then they go out into the real world where there's change and variation and the unexpected and the unknown. And what happens? They get hurt. It's because of how they think. It's their implicit epistemology and metaphysics and how they think ideas relate to the world. It's what's getting them in trouble is them not grasping that the world is full of the variation. What's out there is variation, not some idea in your head. Just because an idea pops into your head or you think something doesn't mean it's true. So there's a lot of things going on here, some different ways to look at it, but that is a good example. That's a fact. That's what some people do. And that comes from not having an ecological approach, If someone thinks and throws out a wide net for evidence and situations, takes a more ecological approach, thinks in a more Aristotelian way, more reality-oriented, they're not going to do something like that. They're not going to get lost in their mind, detached from experience, and think they can do something. But, another example you could think of in terms of forming a concept, looking at similarities and differences, like the squirrel and the dog, or that'd be on a conceptual level, or finding things that are invariant in a situation, perceptually and neurologically. Think about what a sweep is in general in BJJ, or what some particular kind of sweep is, like what the flower sweep or something like that. Think about it as one person adapting to another on a flat, hard surface. Because, you can't do some of these sweeps in space, swimming in water. You got to be on a hard, flat surface. You need to be able to use the earth or a flat, hard surface and your opponent to get things done. You got to look at the environmental demands going on there. That'll help you see the invariance that you need. It's not just swinging a leg, so to speak, or holding your arm here or something, but it's how you're moving in the environment that matters. And that affects, if someone's just thinking, oh, I need to move my leg like this, and I need to grab this, they're not going to be very successful at it. They're not going to really get it. They're not going to become efficient. They need to learn, and they're not going to be able to do it in the hard, messy world when they're doing a real street fight. You need to learn and teach and coach that kind of thing in terms of invariance and how you're moving in the environment. It's the ecological approach. That's more to it. It's not just figuring things out on your own or sparring, So we're starting to see more what it is. Because, an individual action, one way to look at it, besides the variation thing, some other words to use, some other concepts are individual actions and movements and environments vary in many ways. There's many variables and measurements. Think of variation or variable, and there's like we can have different heights, but we have to have some height. There's variation in our height. There's all this difference in measurement for us: eye color, tone of speech, volume of speech, strength. We all have different measurements of our strength and different kinds of strengths. And likewise in the world, when we're moving, when we're acting, there's all these different measurements along certain variables that we have to work with. So the idea of measurement can help, or variable instead of just variation. For some people that'll help a lot, for some that won't, just depends. But helps me. I like it. I like variation and variable and measurement. They all give me insight. They're all very important. As I say, part of understanding is connecting. But so we see the ecological approach is about learning what to perceive to get something done and accomplish some goal. That's more about what it is. It's not sparring. It's not stuff we've already done. It's not we've been doing that for decades. It's not figuring it out on your own. It's about learning and teaching what to perceive to get something done or to accomplish some goal. So that's more about what the ecological approach is. Okay, and I'll add a few other notes in this section. So for one thing, the adapting to our environment perceptually and the neurological changes that occur, it's already known. Dr. Rob Gray discussed some of this, some findings on a recent podcast episode of his, and he discussed how warm-up isn't merely to limber up, get the blood flowing, get mobility working or something like that. Warm-up is to help us adapt on a neurological level to what we're going to be doing, the environment we're going to be working in, doing the things we need to do to achieve the goal we want. There's these fine-scale, immediate, short-term changes that occur to neurons. If I understood it correctly, which I'm pretty sure I did, it was pretty clear the way Dr. Gray described it. He wasn't unclear. He explained things well. But the warming up gets some neurons going and get some changes happening so we're better able to do a sport or whatever. And it helps the animal attain its needs. Because there's a lot of plasticity in the brain. Remember that, and that'll help you understand this better. People used to think that after a certain age, the brain didn't change anymore, but that's been shown to be false. People are limited in what they know and what they've learned, and we only have so much time to investigate things, and we can't know everything, and if we don't have the instruments to help us understand and observe things on a certain level, we can't get there. We can't know those things. But the human brain is known to be plastic and changing, and it's adaptive. So of course, it can't be adaptive unless it's adapting on a short-term skill as well. Because we can't learn quickly unless we can also change our neurons quickly and maybe forget some things quickly. So that's an interesting thing in terms of, that I'll put in here in this context. And then to look at some things in some different ways. So we cannot memorize some words and then do some technique flawlessly, because that is not engaging in this action perception coupling. You know, moving through the world is perceptual and physical, and it's on a motor skill level. It's not on the level of memorizing words. Memorizing words is not moving through our environment. And even when someone teaches us, you know, what's going on, we don't get or understand the words. We can't use them to adapt ourselves and see what we're going to do to adapt to an environment unless we have background context for them. We got to know what they mean and have some understanding. We got to know what they mean, what the words mean, and what the whole sentence means, what a whole sequence of sentences put together might mean and imply, and we got to know the values and feelings that go with them. You know, we got to look at what we've done before in that regard to help us see how they apply to some specific context. You know, we don't learn when we hear words, we learn when we do them. And we have to have done some stuff to understand them. We have to have some prior adaptation to an environment, to environments, adaptations to environments, in order to get what some words mean to help us adapt to some environment. We look at the past adaptations and environments to help us with this adaptation with this environment. And then we got to learn some things new sometimes. And that's thinking about the words, and if someone just tells you something. So, you know, some of that teaching, you don't learn because someone teaches you, you learn in spite of it. That's what some people say about their education. They can do certain things, and they're maybe creative, reasonable, wise, not because of their education, but in spite of their education, regardless of, because they did it on their own. You know, it's not in spite of, in the sense of spiting their education, but it's because what made them who they are was their own self-education and immersion in reality and learning what's there. So if someone could train platonically, let's say, if that's how things work, like Descartes said, they could read a massive amount about BJJ, never practice it, never do anything like it. Okay, maybe we'll allow them to weightlift or something, but they couldn't practice any form of martial art or anything similar. They could just maybe do some strength training. Maybe let's say they do some electrical stimulation shock thing to build muscle. And then they could go out and win a tournament or a real fight, but you know, that doesn't happen, never gonna happen. You can't just read the stuff and then do it. We move through our environment perceptually, not following the orders of some physics and calculus calculating dictator in our head. You know, that idea that you could read a bunch and never practice it or anything like it happen or anything like that. It never happens, never, ever, ever. You know, you can read and learn. You can hear what people say and learn, but you have to put it in context of your own experience. You got to make the words your own. You got to get that word and see what life and experience you have in it that you bring to the table, not someone else. Someone else breathes life into their words, but you get the words, and you know. So when they say it, to see what they say, you got to see what life they put into it. They put life into it. No one else has any authority whatsoever to impute meaning to anyone else. But on our own, when we get their words, if we're going to understand them on our own and do them, that's only with what we know and what we own. Um, so we got to ultimately do it based on our own experience and learn it on our own. We got to adapt to our environment with our own knowledge and our own experience. We have to perceive and move on our own. No one perceives or moves for us. No one else can perceive so we can move, and move so we can perceive. And in that sense, we're always doing it on our own, no matter what. But you know, that's just not, there's more to the ecological approach to that, but I'll talk about some of that later. So someone else, you know, remember, can offer suggestions about what we could do to adapt to our environment. We got to process on our own. We got to go through the OODA loop on our own. And we know that, like, did I already say that? No one can, yeah, about some people thinking they're invincible. Platonic idea doesn't work. Okay, so we got word 4. We moved through an ecology perceptually. So we got that down. Now, let's go on to talk about a little bit about J.J. Gibson and what he believed, and then about putting that in context of fighting and training. Look at the ecological approach, and then the ecological approach to training and to training BJJ.